Welcome to the Story Fulfilled podcast, where we deep dive into how each character and story in the Bible come together to fulfill the story of God.
I'm Jay.
I'm Fletcher, and today's story is about Abraham and his 3 surprise guests.
Surprise!
Oh boy. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Oh no. It'd be quite a shock if we haven't told you who the guests are.
Right.
He immediately notices who they are.
Yeah.
He's like, oh crap, I'm not ready for this.
This isn't the in-laws. This isn't... Yeah.
You know, in Lord of the Rings at the beginning, the Sackville Bagginses show up to Bilbo's house, and he's banged the wall, but he pins himself to the wall. I'm not at home. I'm not here. That's what Abraham's doing, except he's terrified and excited at the same time.
Yeah. The story takes place in the book of Genesis, which... Once again, we are there. And of course, as always, we do encourage you to read the stories for yourselves in order to get the whole picture of what is going on. So you're thinking, okay, they're talking about Abraham. They're talking about 3 guests. You kind of maybe know where we're going with this, or maybe you don't. Maybe you're new to the Bible and to all the things that we're talking about. So let's go on a little journey together. Last week, of course, we talked about Hagar, who was the mother of Ishmael, and we talked about her encounter with God, and she gave God a name, actually, which is, it's kind of neat because she wasn't a Yahweh worshiper. He's not called Yahweh at this point in time, I guess, but
an El worshiper. Yeah,
she's not a worshiper of the one true God at this point, but she gives him a name as the God who sees me, which is pretty cool. Pretty cool given her circumstances. If you don't know what we're talking about, go back and listen to it. But God met her where she was. And so Hagar, as we talked about, was the slave of Abraham, who is today's character.
Hagar isn't the guest.
Hagar is not the guest. She's not one of the 3 guests. But Abraham is who we're looking at today. And so for a biblical background, really, it's the same as last week because their stories are pretty intertwined. But Abraham was called to leave his home. God showed up and called him to leave his home and said, "Go to a land which I will show you." Nothing other than that.
Yeah.
No directions. Not like it's going to be just over the hills to the left
and
or
no
to the east.
Guarantees. Absolutely,
no guarantees.
At this point.
Nothing. Leave everything that gives you security and follow me. Mm-hmm. And spoiler alert, that's what Jesus calls us to on a regular basis. But I'm getting onto the pulpit, and that's not my role right now. So Abraham is called by God to leave his home and go to the land that God will show him. And Abraham obeys and goes to Canaan. And so a little bit later, there's a famine that takes place in Canaan. And so often when famines occur, people end up in Egypt, and that's what happens with Abraham. And they're looking for food. And as we talked about last week, he ran into some problems there and ended up being kicked out. It's never good to lie about your wife and say that it's your sister, and things just don't go well.
I think that's one of the things we've made the most clear on this podcast.
That's right.
Is don't
unequivocally and don't. Yeah. So Abraham, and maybe as a result of this, but probably also because of what was already happening in his life, he's very wealthy. He had many animals and slaves, servants, and he and his nephew, who was traveling with him, also he kept growing more wealthy and wealthy and wealthy, and eventually they outgrew their 2-bedroom apartment. So they realized if we stay together, we're going to step on each other's toes. Our servants and livestock and everything, it's all going to get mixed up. So we need to figure out what we need to do here. And so Abraham comes up with the idea to separate and to not fight. And he says to Lot, whichever way you go, I'm going to go the opposite way. And so Lot goes east. Lot chooses what's best, actually, and goes east. Mm-hmm. And Abraham says, okay, and I'm going to go to the west. Although what was the best, like where Lot went, was the best, because it's the best, it's highly sought after land, and ended up in the middle of some fighting. He ends up in the middle of these cities, and he's fighting wars, and he's captured. But Abraham shows up and goes, and he fights, and he saves him and saves the other kings as well. And there's this interesting encounter that happens with the king of Salem there as well, and some things that Lot resolves not to do, which show the righteousness, and really cool stuff.
I think that's what it's either 16, 15, or 17.
Yeah,
I said those out of order for no particular reason, but it's one of those chapters. It's pretty cool, and it's like naming city, and it's almost overwhelming to read, but it's a cool story if you look into it.
And so just before today's story, we have God making a lot of promises to Abraham, that the whole land of Canaan would one day belong to his family, and that he would have descendants as numerous as the stars, and that through Abraham's seed, the whole world would be blessed. And all Abraham had to do to keep this promise going was for him and his children to be circumcised. Which was a sign of the covenant, and that was a way of them remembering the covenant. And so after this, God says, you will have a son with Sarah, and you will call him Isaac, and he will be who this covenant will come to pass through.
And if you remember back to yesterday's episode, right, Abraham and Sarah are well into their later years. They're, into their 90s, and so Abraham doesn't already have a son with Sarah, so things aren't looking so good on the child department. The whole point of Hagar's story last week, the whole conflict started because they got a little impatient about this promise about having a kid. But anyway, like we talked about last week, we're roughly in the second millennium BC, 18th, 19th century BC, and Abraham is living in what is now modern-day Israel, right near the Jordan River. And so Jay just talked about Abraham and Lot, right? They split up. And so we see Lot going east and Abraham going west. Well, like Jay said, Lot chose the fertile land. And so everybody wants the fertile land. So they're building cities. They're called the cities on the plain. And so this is just on the Jordan River. There's this area where it's nice and fertile. Everybody wants to live there. And so obviously you're going to get lots of conflict and lots of competition. And so Lot chose, like he said, a good spot. Yeah. But everybody wants it. And so Abraham takes the east, which later became, the promised land, the kingdom of Israel. Yeah. So that's where he's settled down. All right, we'll get into our actual story today. It takes place in Genesis chapter 18 of Abraham's 3 visitors. So Abraham, one day he's sitting in his tent. It's the middle of the day, and he's just sitting around, and it says that God, or the Lord, visits Abraham. Wow. And so Abraham sees these 3 men walking up to his tent, and he immediately he realizes who this is. He runs up to them and he bows before them. And he's like, "Please let me wash your feet. Let me get you some water. Let me get you a meal. Stay, and I'll get you something to eat." And they're like, "Okay, no problem." So Abraham, hurries around and he goes and gets water, and he goes, "Hey, Sarah, can you go make some bread? And let's go kill a lamb." And so they serve up this incredible meal, and it's served to them under a tree. So these 3 men are eating their meal. And one of the men asks about Sarah and says, "Where is she?" And Abraham's like, "Well, she's inside." And one of the men says, "You know what? I'm going to come back in a year, and she's going to have a son." They've already been promised this, but once again, God is saying, "You're going to have a son," specifically Sarah. And Sarah's, sitting at the door of the tent, and she overhears this, and she's like, yeah, right. What, now in my 90s, I'm going to have a kid? Whatever.
When I'm this old?
Yeah, I'm this old, I'm going to have a son. And so now the man basically asks Abraham to his face, "So why did your wife laugh about that? What's going on? Is anything too hard for God? You're going to have a son next year." And so Abraham's probably a little bamboozled, like, "Oh, crap, Sarah's laughing." And then Sarah's like, "Oh, no, I didn't laugh. No, what are you talking about?" And then, you're trying to trick the Lord at this point. And so
I love that. Like, she laughed audibly, like out loud, audibly laughed. And then he calls her out on it. And she's like, "No, I didn't laugh."
I've done that. To be fair, like, we think it's ridiculous. We've all done it. We're like, oh.
But what's like I sneezed or
It could be anything.
Something tickled me.
Accidental chuckle.
Yeah.
So, why'd your wife laugh and say, yeah, right? Is anything too hard for God? Mm-hmm. You will have a son by next year. So, Sarah obviously says, oh, I didn't laugh. And, God said, yes, you did. And then they continue on in the conversation. Mm-hmm. I think Sarah's kind of got shut down there. She's going to have a son, and everybody keeps telling her it. Whether or not she believes it at this point, we're not sure. But the story continues. Later, two of the men started to leave, and Abraham saw them off, so they're walking. And the last man, the third man, says this. He says, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous that I will go down and see if it's as bad as what has reached me.
Wow.
And so that's the Lord that is saying that, right? The other two men have gone, and it's the one left, and it says the Lord says this. And Abraham's like, well, are you going to... This is what he's kind of contemplating, right? God has just declared that he's about to destroy these two massive cities. Mm-hmm. By the way, basically where Lot lives.
Right.
And Abraham's like, well, are you going to destroy the righteous and the wicked? Like, I understand if you want to destroy evil and destroy the wicked people, no problem.
Right.
But are you going to destroy the righteous as well? Won't the judge of the earth do right? And so Abraham's kind of asking,
those are strong words to
say
the
God. And that is something cool. I like how humble Abraham is for the rest of this passage, because he's like, if I might ask, if I may, as this humble man who's speaking to the Lord, and he says, won't the judge of the earth do right? And so God says, if I find 50 righteous people, I'll spare the city.
Right.
And then Abraham comes back and he's like, well, what about 45? Would you really destroy the city over 5 missing people? And God goes, for the sake of 45, I won't destroy the city. And so
he's buying a used car or something.
Yeah, they're negotiating, and it's pulling teeth. That's what it is. It's pulling teeth with Abraham and God right now, and they're just going back and forth bargaining on whether or not God is going to destroy this city.
Yeah.
And, of course, Abraham is sitting there kind of humble. He's like, but, oh, Lord, in my humility, would you destroy the city? And they go down, 45, 30, 20. And eventually they get to 10 people. Mm-hmm. And God decides, even for the sake of 10 righteous people, I won't destroy the city. And so that's the end of this part with Abraham, and then God leaves. It says the man left.
They left.
And so the next chapter we'll have to talk about another time, but basically the two men and go and see who's righteous left in the city.
Right.
And, we'll tell it now. There's not 10 righteous people in the city, and so God ends up destroying these two cities. We'll talk about that a little bit later, I think, because if we're going to have a discussion about it, we might have to spoil the next chapter, but I guess we'll see where the conversation with our guest leads, and how much of that part of the story we talk about, and what else we talk about. Absolutely. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening to the Story Fulfilled podcast. I hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you like what you're hearing, or if you don't, feel free to let us know. You can follow us on Instagram at Story Fulfilled Podcast, or email us story@bfmc.org. If you're listening on Spotify, feel free to leave us a review or leave us 5 stars. Now, back to the show. And we're back, Jay. We are back.
We
have a
indeed.
very special guest today
not
for this.
Wait.
Last week you said special guest, and then you said, "Are we ever going to have a special guest?"
Do you want to be
very? We have a very special guest, and the question was, would we ever have a very, very special? And if any of our guests were going to be very, very special, at least to Fletcher, I would have to say that it's today's guest.
Yes, that's right, Jay. You keep telling him that.
You know what? Maybe very, very special to this podcast as well, because I think you might be our number one fan,
number one supporter, listener of every episode. So we have my mom, Tanya Prinsep, on Zoom here. She's calling in with us. She's doing an episode, and so we'd like to thank you so much for coming in to do this episode with us, to talk about this story and tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are. other than
That's
being
great.
my mom.
That's right.
Yes.
Which is would have been a full-time job. She's out of the house now, so that's
More
No,
than a
it's my
full-time
wife's
job.
my wife's full-time job.
Yes. I'm happy to leave that to Riley now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we get started. You can just tell everybody kind of who you are and what you do, I guess, ministry-wise, other than being my mom and doing all the other stuff you do. But yeah.
Okay. Well, like you said, I do have a full-time job that I do. That's my daily job. But Chris and I, Fletcher's dad and I, we run a ministry called Root It and Root It Guest House. And basically it's just welcoming people into our home, people of all different walks of life. And they are welcome to come. And whether it's to spend time with their families, whether it's time to just have fun, or whether it's time as a respite or relaxation or prayer or retreat. We do individuals come, families come, and pastors and teams will join us as well. And it's just something that we felt that God was asking us to do with our home. And we do this all as a ministry, so it's free, because we know that a lot of time people in ministry can't afford to go and take their family away, or can't take the time or the money to spend on going on their own for reading weeks or for prayers, times of prayer or whatever. So that's what we do, and it's an absolute joy. We love it.
It is, and as somebody who has experienced the hospitality of Rooted, both in a ministry context and in a pastor family context, which both were very different from each other, actually, I can say that it truly is a blessing. And
That's great. You can come back anytime.
Yes. And so, you might be wondering, we're talking about this story of Abraham and kind of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is the end of the story. But if you can tell by, I'm just going to call you Tanya for the podcast's sake. I'm sorry.
That's
Mom.
fine. That's okay.
It's not quite a destruction style ministry you're in. It's really a focus on hospitality. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And Abraham in this story has to show some hospitality. So that's what we're going to get into. But first, we have a very special question, a little fun question that we start off the episode with. And here it goes. Have you ever had any really surprise guests arrive that you were not expecting?
Okay. Well, we often get surprise guests. So you can be here, especially in the summertime. If you're here any weekend, we could think that we're going to have like 2 people for dinner, and all of a sudden we have 30 people for dinner. So I often have surprise guests. But I figured this was going to be the question, so I've had some time to think about it.
I didn't even tell her.
Prompt you or tell you. So
you just knew.
Oh, you didn't tell me, but I just thought, they're going to ask
It's
me
your
something about
podcast
surprise
experience.
guests.
You're like, what are they going to ask?
That's right.
She knew it was
What
coming.
are they going to ask? And so I don't know how real we're going to be, but I'm going to be real and embarrass you, Fletcher.
Yes.
But so it's not about Fletcher, but it's about me. And he's going to go, really, Mom, you told the story. So when we lived in Barrie, we had a bathroom right at the front of the house, like one of those little powder rooms. And so one day I was in the bathroom, and Cliff, my brother, came over with the new youth pastor to introduce him to me. And I had the door wide open, and people just walk into my house, and that's how I want it to be. But he just walked in and went, "Hey, Tanya," and I came eye to eye with the new youth pastor with my pants down on the bathroom.
Wow.
I was totally,
Which youth pastor was this?
It wasn't me.
Was it Jay?
No, it wasn't Jay. And it was, you guys were just young. But I just I screamed, shut the door, and Cliff went, "Are you kidding me, Tanya?"
And, the funny thing is that nothing has really changed, because in their new house in Ottawa, the bathroom faces the front door.
That's right.
And so if you're on the toilet and leave the door open at all, you're staring at whoever's walking in. So
you're staring at whoever walks in.
That's happened multiple times, I'm sure, not just with the youth pastor.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was the one I came up with, because I thought, oh my gosh, that was embarrassing.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Oh, good.
So when I lived in Quebec, when we were serving at Cape and Ray, Quebec, our house was it was kind of forced hospitality. We had we lived in community, and so our house was pretty much wide open, and we never locked our doors. It's funny, we had guests who would stay coming from Toronto or whatever, and they would like wedge a hockey stick in the sliding door in the basement, and I was like, there's no point. There's like, we don't lock anything. And so we would always have guests that would come, and students and staff, and always open conversation, table, meals, whatever, all kinds of stuff. But the biggest surprise guest was when we were living there. I looked out the back sliding doors, and there was a raccoon just standing at the back window, or the back sliding door, on his hind legs, kind of peering in the door, like, "Hey guys, can I come in? Can I have some food, please?" And our kids left cat food outside for it, because I guess that's what you do, even though I'm like, no, we don't want that raccoon around.
Right.
And yes, later on in that summer, actually, I regularly chased that raccoon out of our garbage bins, because I'd be trying to sleep and I could hear it rummaging around in the garbage bins outside of our window, and it would keep me up all night.
Fun.
But yeah, it was just kind of like, it was that bold.
Did you
where
name
it's
him?
just no. Well, if we did, it would be Rocky, because Rocky Raccoon. Anyways, yeah.
Fun.
That story ended way better than I thought. I thought you were going to say you came down and it was inside your house.
No. Now I did. The last church that I worked at, we did have a family of raccoons, that like a mother that gave birth inside the walls of the church, and that was an adventure. That was the adventure of adventures. At one point, we had to set up a corral that would lead from the basement up the stairs, out the door, into the parking lot. It was wild.
You have a raccoon story, eh? Or you weren't there. It was your car.
You had the
I
unexpected
can't even.
guess.
That's an unexpected guess. That's a different story, though. I think my answer is when Riley and I were on vacation in the Dominican Republic. If you know me, you know I don't love wearing clothes. So we're in the privacy of our own room, and of course I'm in the buff. And Riley and I are just sitting there, whatever, and somebody knocks on the door, and I'm like, oh. And then it's the cleaning person, so they just knock. And instead of doing the knock, like, hello, is anybody there? They just knock, unlock, walk in, and I'm lying there completely naked. And she goes, oh! And then she takes the little do not disturb sign. She waves it at me and then puts it on the hook.
You
and
could have
then
used
walks
this,
out.
you know.
And
That's
it's like, what the heck? You had to knock more, but also fair enough with the door thing. But
Wow.
I'm surprised that has only happened once.
that's just the one story I'm telling right now. There's
There you go.
probably many stories like that.
Wow.
People have to call before they enter my house most of the time.
That's
Are
right.
you wearing clothes?
That's right. As always, we want to hear your stories as well. So tell us about unexpected guests, a surprise guest that you've had, and fun stories around that. Drop us a line on Instagram, the Story Fulfilled podcast. No, Story Fulfilled
Yeah.
podcast, and story@bfmc.org. I should probably learn our socials, because I give it out all the time.
Every time.
And I'll have to,
And if you have stories with your clothes on, even though 2 out of 3 of these stories weren't clothes on, but
family related too. That's not me.
you can see where it comes from. Maybe. All right,
boy.
let's get into today's episode, into the topic, more biblically focused stuff, I hope, than our weird stories. Anyway, the story starts with Abraham getting these 3 guests, and if you're reading the story and you really think, wow, Abraham kind of goes out of his way to invite these guests into his home, and he makes them fresh bread. He kills an animal and slaughters it and makes them a brand new meal, and he says, please come in, stay, do whatever. That is a type of hospitality that we don't often see now, and it's actually one, if you look in kind of the history and what's going on in the ancient Near East, hospitality and guest rights, guest privileges are something that is really, really ingrained into their society. And if you go read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you'll see that as well, how they had to protect the guests at all costs. And so my question for you is, keeping in mind this idea of ancient hospitality and how much they had to care for their guests, how can we apply that into kind of our lifestyle today? You can answer that however you want.
That
Sorry.
Hospitality. Okay. Yeah, no, that's all right. I think hospitality needs a definition first, because I think in our Western world, when we think of hospitality, we think of entertaining. We think of, Camille Stiles, Martha Stewart. We think that we have to have a perfect home, a perfect place, a perfect circumstance. And that is not what biblical hospitality is. And so culturally, you're right. There are even currently culturally where people really truly understand what hospitality is. And it's about welcoming people. It's about keeping people in a space that is safe and warm and welcoming. It's about taking care of them, whether it's with food or company or drink. It's spending time with them and hearing them out, being a place where people feel that they are important. There was a quote that I've heard and I've used many times, but it says that, entertaining is about me. Hospitality is about you.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think there's a huge difference in that. And so when we see in this story, when Abraham sees these people coming, and we can talk about whether he recognized them or not, but he ran out to them. He didn't just say, come into my space and let me make this a really beautiful meal for you. He ran out and said, let me get you water to wash your feet. And I'm going to go and make bread. I am going to go and make dinner for you. I'm going to take care of you. And so that becomes all about them, not about Abraham's show or Abraham's willingness or desire to be seen.
Wow. Now, I want to bring that back to your ministry, because I know that you have a heart for hospitality, and I've experienced your hospitality. What are some ways that you maybe practically try to incorporate that type of hospitality into Rooted?
Okay. Well, I think what we do is, obviously we have space and we open our home up to people to come and stay. But I think, that's not everybody's experience. Not everybody has guest rooms. Not anybody has the time and space that Chris and I would have. But what we can do, anybody can do, is to, like I said, offer yourselves to people. So that hospitality can be things like inviting people for dinner. It does not have to be a fancy dinner. It could be pizza boxes, right? It could be pizza. It's about listening when people need to talk. It's about just making people feel as comfortable as they can. And one thing that we are very careful to do is we pray before people come, and we say, Lord, what do these people need? What can we offer them? Because we're just normal people. I am not a counselor. I'm not a theologian. I'm not any of those things. But, I can throw coffee on. I can make food, and I can, hang out with you if you want, or I can make space for you to be alone. And I think that's the important thing, is that what we do here is just give people the space and the time and make sure that they're fed, that you meet their needs. So nowadays it's a little different than those days, but people are gluten-free. You try your best to give them gluten-free. If they're dairy-free, you do that. So you try to make people feel like they are welcome and wanted and loved. And I guess that's as much as we can do.
Yeah,
right?
I love that. And actually I have two thoughts on that. One, just as you talk about praying before people come, I think that just speaks to a spiritual presence. And yeah, just like I was reminded actually today in one of the classes that I'm in, that God is always at work, and God is always at work in the lives of the people that we encounter. And so a great prayer of hospitality is, God, I know that you're at work in these people's lives. Could you reveal to me what that work is and how I can step into that? And that could be, that could be a multitude of ways that's worked out, and that you would express that, or that you would step into that. And then the second thing that I thought was really neat is you talk about making space. And I think that you actually do that in a very unique way, as I've spent time, like I said, a couple of times in the Rooted environment, or as I like to refer to it as just Chris and Tanya's. But as I've spent time there, what I find interesting about making space is that doesn't mean that you disappear or that you stop living your life. Like when we've stayed with you, it's not uncommon for other people to just pop in the house and come and go, and people walking their dogs, and family members and friends coming and going, or to come downstairs and for somebody to be sitting at the table eating a meal, and then you just join in with them and you're eating a meal with them. Life doesn't stop in order to
No.
be hospitable and to welcome the outsider.
Right. It's interesting you say that, because I think one of the things, now we've had people who come and they really need to be alone. And we're willing, obviously we want to do that for them. And so we will give them that space to be alone, and serve them in their rooms or serve them in their own space. But I think what's really interesting about what you just said there is, when do you feel love is when you feel part of something. Right? And you feel like so what we always say is, you're becoming part of our family, even if it's for a short time. And when you have people in your family, sometimes you're together with them. Sometimes they're in the room. Sometimes you go with one or two of them. And we had a really interesting one lady who had come, and she had wanted space of her own. And so I said, yes, you can come, but just know that I have my big, huge, loud family coming for Thanksgiving on Sunday. And she said, well, that's okay. And I said, you can just, if you want to stay upstairs, you don't need to join us. And on the Sunday, they all came over. And if you know that, Fletcher, put Fletcher and I and multiply that by 20 people. We're not a quiet group. And we were playing cards and having dinner. And I came upstairs and I just said, are you okay? Can I bring you dinner? And she said, can I join you? And I said, sure, come on down. So she came and joined our family. She joined our euchre tournament. And I got an email from her after, and she said, thank you. Thank you. I needed family.
Wow.
So thank you and your family for inviting me into your family.
That really, to kind of connect that to the story, it's like when you're inviting somebody into your home, it's not just, oh, here's a bedroom and here's a food and just deal with it like that.
That's a hotel.
It's not a hotel, right? When you're inviting somebody as a guest in hospitality, you're inviting them into your life, into your home. It's not, like you said, not just a hotel. That is something that I don't think you'd necessarily understand just reading this story, right? You see, okay, well, Abraham, he just got him some food, but he actually invited them and offered them whatever they needed, which is really cool to connect that to real life. And you said something. It's you're giving up of your own. You're not disconnecting from your own life, but you're giving up of your own life in order to serve people. You see that when Abraham does it. You see that later on when the two men go to visit Lot. He's willing to sacrifice. This I wouldn't apply this necessarily today. He's willing to sacrifice his own family members to protect his guests because they had become a part of their family for that short time.
Right.
And so that's the crazy hospitality that they were willing to show, but that we can also apply in a different sense, in a better sense, hopefully.
Yeah, there's a cultural unpacking there that we're not getting into today, but
just
don't do that.
That willingness to give of your own stuff, your own family, your own life to help the other people that you're being...
Your own resources.
Yeah, exactly.
Your own space. And I think it's something like hospitality is one of those things that biblical hospitality is what I'm talking about here. It's been misconstrued or misunderstood. I still, like I said, the Western society and the idea of entertaining, but even within the church, oftentimes the people with gifts of hospitality are the ones who, bake cookies for certain things or they're the ones that end up doing the services in the kitchen. And those are really needed and they're really great. But hospitality is for everybody. Like, we are called to be hospitable. He asks us to practice hospitality. Practice is something that you got to do a lot of. It doesn't say do it once. Right. And everybody has different ways of doing it. And that's okay, because you're going to be hospitable differently than I am. But we are to be hospitable in our hearts. And I think that's a really important piece of this story, is that Abraham went out, he invited him in, he made bread, he gave, he saw, I think was it lamb that he did, and he made this dinner for them. And he walked them out is also, right? He walked a ways with them, which might have been cultural, but at the same time it was, I want to be with you. You're important enough to me. Right. You're not standing at the door going, okay, when are these people leaving?
Absolutely.
Just
the verse that kind of comes to mind with the New Testament connection verse that kind of comes to mind is when Jesus is talking about the people. I wish I could pull it up. I'll try to pull it up. But Jesus says, well, when did we do this to you, Lord?
Right.
And he said, when you did it for the least of these, you did it for me. And so he kind of talks about the idea of like people are knocking at your door and you opening up your door and opening up your home to people. You're actually opening up to Jesus as well. You're not just doing it for some guy you might not know, some person you might not know or might not even like, but you're doing it to Jesus himself when you do it to anybody, right? That's a really cool thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing because I think when we, and I don't always have that, I'd love to say I'm always thinking that way. Like anybody else, you kind of make the wrong decision or you do it for the wrong motives or whatever. But when we picture ourselves that every single person that walks through our door, I'm serving Jesus, and I'm doing it for him and not just for the person. It's just doing it in the name of Jesus. It totally changes your mindset. When you have to get up early to make breakfast or you have to put yourself out. That's just what we do here. But, the people who say, do you want to go for coffee? And you're like, oh, no, I don't really want to go for coffee. And yet if Jesus asked you to go for coffee, you'd be there in a second. You'd show up early and you'd pick up the tab.
Yeah.
And so the next thing I kind of want to talk about this kind of in the end of the story, Abraham starts negotiating with God. So, if there's one righteous person, 50 righteous people, 50, 45, 40, 30, and they get down to 10, and they have this kind of weird negotiation thing where it seems like Abraham has changed God's mind in some way. But there's kind of this idea. I think God knew already how many righteous people were in the town. He knew that it was just going to be a lot. And so we kind of have to think through this idea of why did Abraham have to talk to God about this? Why did Abraham go through this whole experience of talking to God about how many righteous people are in this city,
right.
and they had to fight over it? And so the question I want to bring up and ask is, do you think it has anything to do with Abraham trying to figure out who God is and God showing Abraham who he was? And that only happens through a sort of negotiation. Now we're talking about Jacob next week, and there's this idea of wrestling, so we won't get into that too much, but this idea of you have to struggle and you have to talk with God to be able to figure out who he is. And so that's the question I have is, what do you think of that? What do you make of that as idea of wrestling with God? Not in the Jacob sense maybe, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the thoughts I had about that was, God was setting Abraham to be a leader of nations, right? He was going to be the leader of this nation. In doing that, he wants him to be prepared. And so you needed to learn to intercede for people. You need to learn to pray for people and to talk to God, because that's what we, want as leaders. We want leaders to be invested in their people, and to pray for their people. And I also think, like you said, it's important that Abraham learned who God was, because I think God knew I know that God knew what the outcome was going to be, and he knew how many righteous people were there. But he allowed Abraham to say, what's the line? Would he say, will you, God, a good God? How does he say it? A big God, a righteous
would
God?
a just God destroy this many righteous people, right?
And so I think Abraham was kind of saying, hey, because that question, we ask that all the time. Like our world asks that. God, how can you let bad things happen to people, right? And so I think he was just asking a question that we all wrestle with, and getting to know who God is. So to have God say, you know what, Abraham, you know what, for 50 righteous people I would. And he goes all the way down, right? For 5 righteous people. Or 6, I think. What is it, 5 or 6? Or 10.
10 at the end,
righteous people. 10 righteous people, I would. And it just shows God's mercy and compassion and that opportunity for Abraham to get to know him. That's my thoughts anyway.
I think it's interesting because we always default to say Lot was the only righteous one. But I think the reality is no one was righteous, right? Like when because we even talk, like the question that you said the world brings up, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, Jesus says no one is good but God. And so the reality is none of us are righteous, none of us are good, unless, and the Bible tells us, we recognize our need for Jesus. That is the act of righteousness, is recognizing our need for Jesus and allowing him to be our righteousness. And so I think there's also that's being uncovered and exposed to Abraham, saying like, none. There aren't any, actually, and he's forced to, because he's like, what about 50? And then he's like, oh wait, maybe there aren't 50. Maybe there aren't 40. Like, how many actually are there?
And when you connect it to this story, it's like, who's the people that God showed mercy on? And the answer is to Abraham, because you see Abraham was counted as righteous because he had faith.
Right.
That's where his righteousness came from. And who else was spared in that city? It's Lot. And what happened when the men went and visited Lot? He invited them in, and he believed them what was going to happen.
Right,
like
right.
if he had just tossed the men out and say, "You're crazy," right, the city's going to be destroyed.
Yeah.
It's his faith, it's belief and trust that in God to save him. And so he was able to actually leave the city with his family, and faith is what saved him again, in a physical sense.
Right.
And faith is what saves Abraham. Faith is what continues to save us up until now.
Which I think as well, just to carry on that, which gives me hope, because when I talk about there is no one that is righteous, it gives me hope that believing in God is what makes us righteous, because both Lot and Abraham had a lot of mess. There's a lot of mess going on in there, right? And so you look at them and you're like, if that's righteousness, like what the heck? But it's believing and trusting in Jesus that is our righteousness.
The other thing I thought too when you were just speaking there is that I think it's also an example of how we should pray specifically. I mean, he kind of wakes his way down. If we have, this many, can you save? If we get this many, whereas he could have just asked right from the beginning, can you save my nephew Lot and his family? Just a thought, right? Like he could have gone right to the 10 right from the beginning, and just asked specifically. I don't know. Just a thought in terms of when we pray. Do we pray specifically, or do we kind of go, well, Lord, maybe you could possibly maybe do this?
And I think that there's a balance there. It's like he was trying to be humble in a sense, and he's fearing God. Like, no, I'm not going to ask too much of him. But it was in that conversation with God that he realized that he almost had to be specific, because God was just working with him down, all the way to the smallest number, right? Yeah. So it was in that conversation with God. So maybe if you're starting off with prayer, you could start off broad. But as you grow in relationship with him, you can start to ask more of him, and it's going to create a deeper relationship, and that's how you get closer with God, is in that negotiation, I think.
Yeah.
And so
because it's not, God is never he's not a genie. Like, you don't say I want this and he gets it. Like, that's not how how that works, but
surely a pastor deserves a Lamborghini.
Or the nice $500 sneakers that Jay doesn't have on. They weren't $500. They weren't. No. So the last question we like to ask, and you can answer this however you'd like, or however you think it needs to be answered, but the final question in all our episodes is, how does this story come together to fulfill the story of God? And it can be a recap of what we've already talked about. That's usually part of it. But however you want to answer that, what do you think?
Well, I think there's two things there, because we know that God, we think it's Jesus, appeared, is one of the three men, right? And so the Lord appears to him, and it's Jesus and two men. And I say Jesus only because we can't see the face of God, and so we have to maybe assume that it is Jesus. And he'd appeared to him before in Genesis 12 and Genesis 17 as well. But I think the thing that catches me is that it shows the character that God is involved. He's aware of what's happening in our world. He wants to meet with us. Now, we may not see him in person like that, but we will see him, and we can hear him, and we can speak to him, and we can spend time with him. That's part of who he is. He's intricately involved and interested in what happens to us, like he was with Abraham and Sarah, and with Lot, and with he went and talked to him, and he told Abraham what was going to happen, and he shows up. And I think that's part of that story that we see throughout the entire scriptures, to the point where Jesus shows up here on earth to save us. But that's just part of who God is. He's aware, he shows up, and he sends messengers, and and he's involved in our lives.
That's Emmanuel.
That idea of God with us, absolutely.
Love it.
Jay, do you have anything to add to that answer?
I did. I added Emmanuel. That's it.
Got it.
That's it. Like I do. I think it really does. It puts on display Jesus' desire to meet us and to be, and that's it. Enter in right into our situation and lead and guide us through it.
And I think I just leave it with, in the same way that Abraham literally clothed and fed and helped God out, helped Jesus out, if we're going to take this encounters with Jesus thing. In the same way, like the verse I quoted earlier, anything you do for the least of these, you've done for me. And so if you see people who need hospitality in every sense of the word that we've kind of discussed, you're doing it for Jesus and not just for some random person, right? That is the connection point, I think, to our world right now. And so I think that's it. I think that's really it, is God is with us, and he has called us to be hospitable as well.
Yeah.
And to be Jesus to others.
To be Jesus to others, yeah. Absolutely. Cool. So thank you so much for having us on, Tanya, Mom, whatever you want to call you. But
wait, did she have it? Is this... Wait, were we secretly recording for her podcast?
You weren't on my podcast.
Oh, no.
I was on yours.
They're going to post it. Yeah. If you go listen to... Oh, you can throw a
your podcast.
You can throw a plug in.
No, you can't throw it out yet because it's not out. But, once you do, you can throw it out.
Okay. You don't want to plug it right now? Just in case?
Because
stay tuned?
Just in case. Just stay tuned. It's coming around my table.
Around my table. Keep that in mind, listeners of the Story Fulfilled podcast. If you want to hear another podcast hosted by Tanya, and it's pretty cool. It talks about a lot of hospitality. So if you like that kind of thing and you want to hear some cool stories of people doing ministry, it's a great listen. I haven't heard it. I'm just assuming. But again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, guys. I love what you guys are doing. It's wonderful.
All right. Thanks.
Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
Bye for now.